What are the factors that determine fat oxidation levels of fat oxidation during exercise? In other words, what are the various factors that determine how much fat you actually burn when you work out? Well, let's take a look at what science has to offer in that area. First of all, what you eat actually has a lot to do with how much fat you burn. For example, carbohydrate intake. If you eat carbohydrate in proximity to a workout or right before a workout, it'll suppress fat oxidation because what happens is the carbohydrate is your preferred source of fuel for muscular activity. The body will always seek to use carbohydrates such as glucose and glycogen before it uses fat. Fat is more of a long-term source of energy. Ingesting carbohydrates before exercise will raise insulin release, and that suppresses fat oxidation up to as much as 35%. And this effect of insulin on fat oxidation can last as long as 6 to 8 hours after a meal. So that means that the highest rates of fat oxidation usually occur after an overnight fast. That being said, you might say, well, maybe that explains why people like to do aerobics, first thing in the morning on an empty stomach with the hopes of burning more fat. Unfortunately, this is one of those things that works better on paper than in actual practice. The studies have shown that whether you do fasting aerobics, where you haven't eaten for a couple hours before you do the aerobics, or whether you eat a meal before you do the aerobics, doesn't make much difference as far as fat burning. With that, it's more related to the overall intake of calories. Another thing that's very important, of course, is the exercise intensity. The higher the level of intensity, the more the body has to rely on glucose circulating in the blood, and most importantly, muscle glycogen. In other words, that's with high intensity. A lot of people like to do what they call high intensity interval aerobics. Unfortunately, the higher intensity that brings your heart rate up to as much as 80 to 90% of maximum will rely almost entirely on glucose and glycogen. So when you do high intensity interval aerobics, you're actually burning carbohydrates, much more carbohydrates than fat. But because of the increased intensity, you get a kind of a higher metabolic rate, which might kind of last for a couple of hours after the workout, with the net effect being that the difference in fat burning between high intensity interval aerobics and, let's say, steady state aerobics, where you just keep your pulse or heart rate at a certain steady level throughout, let's 30-45 minutes, it's not much different. It doesn't really make much difference. What they found, however, in studies, if you're looking at pure fat oxidation during exercise, the maximum amounts of fat oxidized during exercise in science is referred to as fat max. And what the studies have shown for trained individuals, meaning people that have had training experience, the fat max usually is between 62 and 63% of maximum oxygen intake. It can go as high as 70 to 75% of maximum of a heart rate. In other words, to see the 62 to 63% of maximum oxygen intake, which would equal about 70-75% of maximum heart rate. That's if you have a trained individual. If you're somebody that's new to exercise and you don't have developed the oxidative enzymes in muscle to burn fat or oxidize fat, the fat max level is only 50% of VO2 max. So basically, if you were going strictly for fat oxidation, you would want to do, let's say, very moderate to low intensity aerobics. So again, as soon as you increase your heart rate above, let's say, 70%, you're going to be going to glucose and glycogen. The longer you work out, for example, after 60 minutes, your body starts to, the glycogen and glucose levels start to decrease, and your body veers more towards fat oxidation. If you did aerobics for 90 minutes, which I don't recommend, you'd be burning mostly fat with very little carbohydrate involved. So that's another thing to account. They've shown in studies that as far as the modes of exercise, running seems to increase fat oxidation more than cycling. Any type of exercise will use more muscle, such as the elliptical machine. We're using your arms and your legs, and you're standing up. Even treadmill, anything standing up generally burns more fat than doing something seated, like, for example, cycling. Burn more fat when they work out than men, and they think it has to do with estrogen. In a study in which 150 men and 150 women were compared over a wide range of exercise intensity, it was demonstrated that the women had higher rates of fat oxidation over the entire range of intensities, and fat oxidation peaked at slightly higher intensity. But the differences were not that much. They were kind of small. So, it doesn't, the women burn a little bit more fat, but in the end, the fat tends to go right back on them. So, let's leave it at that. As far as environment goes, when you train in a hot environment, your body uses more glycogen. It tends to dig into the stored glycogen, which is stored carbohydrate, and that tends to reduce fat use. So under high temperature or hot environments, you will be burning a little bit less fat. Also, the same occurs during high altitude. Some studies say that when you train under extremely cold conditions, carbohydrate will be also used at the expense of fat metabolism. However, more recent studies show that training under cold conditions stimulates the synthesis of what they call brown adipose tissue, which is a highly thermogenic tissue, which turns basically fat calories into heat. So actually training, if you can handle it, and training under a cold environment will actually burn more fat. So what are some other factors that affect fat oxidation? Let's see. You have, I mentioned the altitude, the hot environment. There's a couple of supplements that supposedly help you oxidize fat. I should also point out, I've mentioned this in past videos, there's no so-called pure fat burning supplement. There's no supplement on the market that will actually burn fat unless you exercise. If you take any of these highly touted fat burners and you sit around and you don't exercise, you're not going to be burning any fat at all. But what they do is they promote the mobilization of fat. In other words, the fat burner supplements help your fat cells to release fat, but the only way to actually oxidize or burn the fat is you have to exercise. So let's say a couple of the supplements that are touted to increase fat oxidation. Carnitine is probably the most famous. The only problem is carnitine works by shuttling fatty acids into the mitochondria portion of cells. The mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cells. This is where fat oxidation actually takes place. And without carnitine, you can't get the fatty acids into the mitochondria. So carnitine is important. Carnitine is produced in the body from 3 amino acids. Normally there isn't a problem. A lot of people take carnitine, supplemental carnitine, in the hopes of increasing fat oxidation. Unfortunately, studies have shown that when you take supplemental carnitine, you increase the plasma or blood levels of carnitine, but not necessarily the muscle levels of carnitine. And the muscle is where the fat is oxidized. They've shown studies a couple of years ago that if you ingest carbohydrate with supplemental carnitine, you can increase muscle carnitine levels by 15%. It doesn't sound like much, but it actually makes a big difference. Unfortunately, the amount of carbohydrate needed to do this, the way it works is the carbohydrate stimulates insulin output, especially simple or fast-acting carbohydrates. The increased insulin actually pushes the supplemental carnitine into the muscle, so you get a 15% greater increase of carnitine in the muscle. However, some of the studies I've seen, they're telling you to ingest as much as 95 grams of simple carbohydrate. I don't think that's a good idea. That much carbohydrate is, even with the increased carnitine in the muscle, it's going to inhibit fat burning. I don't think it's a good idea. So the studies vary. Some studies show that carnitine does help with increased fat oxidation. Others don't. So it's kind of up in the air there. Another supplement touted to increase fat oxidation is green tea. Green tea has a minor thermogenic effect. Unfortunately, 90% of the research showing that green tea helps fat oxidation involved animals. There was a study showed that increasing a green tea extract the night before and an hour before a 30-minute cycling bout increased fat metabolism by 20%. That was a study published in 2008. The active ingredient in green tea is something called epigallocatechin gallate, or EGCG. It's a very powerful polyphenol with antioxidant properties, and the way it helps to increase fat oxidation, it increases the activity of the enzyme responsible for the breakdown of catecholamines, adrenaline and noradrenaline, and that can result in higher concentrations of catecholamines. Catecholamines stimulate the release of fat from fat cells, and that's how it works. Green tea extract, when used in certain doses, supposedly produces a 20% improvement in fat metabolism, which is pretty good. Of course, caffeine is a primary ingredient in almost all fat burner supplements. Caffeine works by also stimulating the release of catecholamines like norepinephrine, epinephrine, which in turn stimulate fat cell enzymes that cause the mobilization and release of fatty acids stored in fat cells as triglyceride. So again, caffeine mobilizes fatty acids from fat cells, and if you exercise, it will help you burn more fat. A recent study that just came out found, a lot of people think that, or the past studies, suggested that if habitual drinking of coffee, in other words, if you drink coffee every day, your body kind of gets used to it, and you don't get any ergogenic effects after a while. No fat, no increased fat oxidation effect, nothing. However, this new study, which surveyed the current research, found that's not true. You don't get used to coffee. It keeps working as long as you take it, and the amount of coffee shown to have ergogenic effects and fat burning effects is 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. That equals about 300 to 400 milligrams, amount found in about 3 to 4 cups of coffee, and that's it for coffee. So what else can I tell you? Cayenne pepper has a thermogenic effect. That might stimulate a little bit of fat burning. And forskolin stimulates an increase of what they call cyclic AMP, which stands for cyclic adenosine monophosphate, which is a breakdown product of ATP. And cyclic AMP actually is the trigger for the release of fat from fat cells. So theoretically, forskolin can help you burn a little extra fat. Conjugated linoleic acid, or CLA, has been touted as a fat burner. Some studies show it works, some studies show it doesn't. I wouldn't suggest wasting money on it for fat burning. And I mentioned green tea, pyruvate. I think that's about it. So there you go. That's about it for the factors that affect fat oxidation, whether it's exercise and nutrition. And I should also point out that, people, you probably know this from experience if you've been training for a long time. Even at best, if you do everything right, you do the right level of exercise intensity. You don't have too many carbohydrates before you work out. This and that. You do enough frequency, which is about 4 times a week of aerobics to affect body composition. You're still only going to burn a little bit of fat. You're not going to burn a lot of fat even under the best of conditions. So what that means is that you can't depend on exercise alone as an efficient means of fat oxidation. Yes, it definitely helps, but without the proper diet, which means a reduction in overall calories. And if you're sensitive to carbohydrates, you want to reduce carbohydrates considerably also. When I was in bodybuilding, the only diet that ever worked for me was a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet. Unless I reduced carbohydrates, I just couldn't burn fat no matter how many. Well, I wasn't even doing aerobics back then. In the 70s, nobody did aerobics. But still, I tried all the diets. The only diet that ever worked for me was a low-carb diet. But that's me. That's my genetics. Doesn't necessarily work. Other people can have some carbohydrate and still lose plenty of fat. However, I would strongly suggest trying to avoid the ingestion of simple or fast-acting or high glycemic carbohydrates in proximity for a workout, because it will blunt fat burning. And of course, drinking carbohydrate drinks during a workout, that will maybe help you work out longer, because it'll keep your blood glucose levels up. But as far as fat burning, shut off completely. You won't burn any fat if you drink a carbohydrate drink during a workout. So that's about it for this topic. The topic, of course, is ways to increase fat oxidation during exercise. If you want more information on nutrition, exercise science, anti-aging research you can use today, effective fat loss methods, ergogenic aids, hormonal therapy, supplement science, which supplements work, which ones don't, women's health and fitness, many other topics. No one covers as many topics as I do in my Applied Metabolics newsletter. Subscribe today, www.appliedmetabolics.com. When you subscribe, I'll send you an invitation to join my private Applied Metabolics Facebook page, where each day I post new information on exercise, nutrition, general health, and medicine. I have an email portal on my Applied Metabolics web page where current subscribers only can send me short questions about anything they might have read in Applied Metabolics, anything that comes to mind, and as a appreciation of their subscription, I'll answer the question. Of course, that means that unsolicited questions will have to go unanswered. I appreciate the support of my subscribers. However, unsolicited questions, if you want to have a consult with me and pay for it, that's different. I don't have time to answer unsolicited questions. I don't think anybody does. But that's about it. If you want to have the best friend you'll ever have, go to your local shelter, adopt a dog.